Evelyn Hartley, Duchess of Rothermere, stood in the doorway of Larch Cottage with one hand braced against the frame, and the child inside her turning slow as a tide. And she did not scream. She did not weep. She did not drop the basket of willow bark and beef tea she had carried 3/4 of a mile through frost for a woman she had been told was merely feverish. She set the basket down on the flagstones, gently, as though the cottage itself was sleeping and she did not wish to wake it, and she looked at her husband's coat thrown over the back of a chair that was not his, and at Ophelia Marsh's hand resting where it had no right to rest. And she said only, "I see," and turned, and walked home through the cold with her skirts gathering frost at the hem. By the time she reached Rothermere Hall, she had already decided what would happen next. She had decided it 4 months earlier, on a wet Tuesday in Mr. Josiah Lowe's office in Denby Cross, when suspicion had first hardened into certainty, and she had asked him to draw up the papers just in case, and lock them in his drawer, and wait for her word. She did not have to send for them now. She only had to send the word. In his study at Rothermere Hall, Nathaniel Raine, 9th Duke of Rothermere, found the papers waiting on his desk an hour after he left the cottage, still smelling faintly of wood smoke and someone else's rosewater. He read the top line twice before it made sense to him. He read it a third time before his hands began to shake. Not violently, not the way a man shakes in a temper, but the particular tremor of a man who has just understood that the flaw he assumed was permanent was in fact a courtesy someone else had been extending to him all along. By morning she would be gone to her mother's old house at Hartley Chase, and he would spend the better part of a year learning what he had called, in a careless sentence to his cousin 18 months before, merely useful. The spring of 1819 had come to Denby Cross the way it always did, indifferent to what it found waiting for it. New lambs, old debts, a young duke recently returned from London with a bride nobody in the county had expected him to choose. Evelyn Hartley had not been chosen for her face, though she was not plain, nor for her fortune, though there had been enough of one left after her father's death to settle the marriage cleanly. She had been chosen because her father, before the fever took him, had spent 30 years teaching her to read a ledger the way other girls were taught to read music, and because the old Duke, Reginald Raine, had died leaving Rothermere's accounts in the kind of disorder that took a particular mind to unknot, and because Nathaniel, newly titled and entirely unwilling to be managed by anyone who might expect to be loved for it, had wanted a wife who would ask him for very little. She gave him exactly that. For 2 years she ran his house, corrected his steward's arithmetic without ever being asked, corresponded with his tenants when he could not be troubled to, and carried herself through county dinners with a composure people mistook for coldness, because they had never seen what it cost to produce it. She was, by any honest accounting, the reason Rothermere's rents came in on time and its roofs did not leak. Nathaniel knew this the way a man knows the weather is fair, gratefully, absently, without once considering that the weather might prefer to be thanked. She had overheard the sentence that named her 7 months into the marriage, through a half-open door, in his cousin Silas Rook's flat, unbothered voice, asking whether he did not find it dull, marrying a woman for her arithmetic. Nathaniel's answer had come without hesitation. "She is not a woman I love," he'd said. "She is a woman I require. There is a difference, and it suits us both." She had not told him she'd heard it. She had gone back to the account books that evening and found, for the first time in her marriage, that her hand was not quite steady on the pen. She had written the sentence into no ledger. She had simply begun, from that night, to keep a private accounting of her own, of what was owed her, and by whom, and in what coin it might eventually be paid. The pregnancy, discovered in the new year, changed nothing between them that she could see. He asked after her health at breakfast, with the same flat courtesy he asked after the weather. He did not touch her hand across the table. He began, not long after, to be gone from the hall 3 and 4 afternoons a week, and it was Mrs. Hale, the housekeeper, who first told her, not unkindly, but without softening it either, where those afternoons were spent. Evelyn had gone to Larch Cottage herself, rather than send anyone else, because she had decided, long before she knew what she would find there, that she would rather see a thing plainly than have it described to her second hand. Now she knew. She sat that evening in the walled garden on the bench beneath the old pear tree, her watch open in her palm, and permitted herself exactly 10 minutes. She did not weep during them. She had never found weeping useful, and usefulness was, after all, the only thing this marriage had ever asked of her. She sat with her hands folded over the child, and let the feeling move through her. Grief, yes, and something colder and older than grief, something closer to insult, and when the 10 minutes ended, she closed the watch, with a small definite click, and stood. There was a drawer in her mind, unlabelled to anyone but herself, where feelings went when there was work still to be done. She had built it years ago, after her father's death, when there had been a house to save and no time to fall apart in the saving of it. She opened it now, and set the evening inside, the cottage, the coat, the hand where it should not have been, and closed it, and went in to find Mrs. Hale. "You'll want tea," Mrs. Hale said, before Evelyn had said a word, and did not ask why, because she had already guessed, and because in 30 years of service at Rothermere Hall she had learnt that some questions were kinder left unasked. "I want a fire lit in the west sitting-room," Evelyn said, "and I want Mr. Lowe sent for in the morning, and I want," she added, after a small pause, setting her palm flat against the small of her back, where the child had begun to press, "an inventory of what is mine, all of it, written down, so that no one may later claim to have forgotten." Mrs. Hale looked at her for a long moment, the way she had looked at Evelyn on her wedding day, weighing something. "Land, money, or grievance?" she asked at last. "All 3, Evelyn said. "But begin with the land." She had Hartley Chase. 340 acres her mother had loved, and her father had kept solvent by will alone, and she had a mind that had run Rothermere's books for 2 years, without a single figure out of place, and she had a child coming in 10 weeks, who would carry the Rothermere name, whether its father had earned the right to it or not. It was not nothing. It was, she thought, setting the account book open on her lap that night by candlelight and beginning, in her small even hand, to write very nearly everything a person needed, if she was willing to build with it rather than simply survive on it. The papers went to Rothermere's desk 3 days later, delivered by Mr. Lowe's clerk, while Nathaniel was again at Larch Cottage, because Evelyn had learned, in 2 years of managing a household run by absent men, that the most effective correspondence was the correspondence that arrived precisely when it would be least convenient to ignore. She was in the drainage field above Hartley Chase's east boundary, ankle deep in mud, with her skirts pinned up and a surveyor's chain in her hands, when word reached her that the Duke had ridden out from Rothermere Hall 3 times in a single afternoon looking for her, and had been told, each time, that her Grace was occupied. She was, in fact, occupied. Hartley Chase's lower fields had flooded twice in 3 years for want of proper drains, and every tenant on that stretch of land had lost a portion of the harvest to standing water, while her father's old steward assured everyone the ditches were sound. They were not sound. Evelyn had walked the field herself with old maps and a length of chain, and had found within a morning that the drainage ran uphill in 2 places, a fact the previous steward had either never noticed or never dared report, since correcting it would cost money nobody had wanted to spend. £90, she told Abel Ferris, the tenant whose fields bore the worst of it, laying the figures out on a plank set across 2 barrels, because there was no table nearer than the farmhouse, and she had not wanted to lose the light walking to fetch one. 60 for tile, 30 for the labour. Done properly, and done before the autumn rains, and I will not ask you to bear a shilling of it, because it was never your ditch to begin with. It was Rothermere's failure to maintain what it charged you rent to farm. Ferris was a broad, slow-spoken man who had buried 2 children to a bad winter and trusted very little that came from a great house. He looked at the figures a long time. "Begging your pardon, your grace," he said, "but I've heard fine numbers from fine houses before. They don't always turn to tile." "Then watch them turn," Evelyn said. They turned. She hired the drainman herself, out of Hartley Chase's own accounts, rather than waiting on Rothermere's approval, and she walked the field twice a week in her boots and her plain wool cloak to see the work done properly, and by the end of 3 weeks the water that had stood ankle-deep in Ferris's lower field for 3 summers ran clean and fast into the culvert where it belonged. Ferris did not thank her in words. He sent, the following market day, a basket of his wife's early plums to the kitchen at Hartley Chase, with no note attached, which Mrs. Hale, when she heard of it, pronounced the equivalent of a knighthood. It was Silas Rooke who mentioned the debt first, and mentioned it the way a man mentions whether he intends to make use of later, in passing, at the end of a longer conversation about something else entirely, over supper at Rothermere Hall, on one of the rare evenings Evelyn consented to sit at the same table as her husband, while the papers of separation moved slowly through Mr. Lowe's careful hands. "Odd thing, going through my uncle's old accounts," Silas said, turning his wine-glass by its stem without drinking from it. "There's a note among them. Your father's signature, I believe. Cousin Evelyn, for a considerable sum, borrowed against Hartley Chase itself, some years before he died. I don't suppose you'd know anything of it." "I know my father's accounts better than any man living," Evelyn said, without looking up from her plate. "There is no such note, perhaps not one you've seen," Silas said pleasantly, and let the subject drop as easily as he had raised it, which told Evelyn, more than anything he might have said outright, that he intended to raise it again when it would do the most damage. Nathaniel had watched the exchange without speaking, and it was the first time in 2 years Evelyn had seen him watch her at all. Not the automatic courtesy glance of a man confirming his wife was present and unembarrassing, but something slower, more considering, as though he were reading a ledger column he had never troubled to check before, and finding it did not sum the way he'd assumed. He said nothing to her that night. But 2 evenings later, when she was going over Hartley Chase's harvest figures alone by the fire in the west sitting-room, he appeared in the doorway and stood there a moment before he spoke. "The drainage," he said. "Ferris's field. I rode past it today. And? It's dry," he said, as though this were a fact requiring some effort to accept. "It hasn't been dry in 3 years. "No," Evelyn agreed, not looking up from the page. "It hasn't." He did not sit. He did not stay long. But it was, she noted, marking it in her private accounting the way she marked everything now. The first unprompted sentence he had spoken to her in a fortnight that was not a courtesy about her health, and she found, setting down her pen after he had gone, that she had noticed it more than she wished to admit. The second trial came a month later, when the parish overseers proposed cutting the wages of Rothermere's harvest labourers from 14 shillings a week to 9, on the grounds that the estate's finances were, in the confusion of the separation proceedings, uncertain, and economies must be found somewhere. Evelyn found the economy elsewhere. She went through 2 years of Rothermere's accounts she had, in fact, largely kept herself, and found 11 separate instances of money spent on entertainments in London that had produced nothing for the estate but the appearance of a duke enjoying himself, totalling more than 4 times what the wage cut was meant to save. She brought the figures to the overseers' meeting herself, uninvited, and read them aloud without raising her voice, and watched 3 respectable men who had never once addressed her directly in 2 years of marriage discover, over the course of 20 minutes, that they had been arguing against arithmetic. "The wages remain at 14 shillings, she said, when she had finished. "I will find the difference myself, out of Hartley Chase, if Rothermere cannot. I will not have men go hungry so that a household can pretend an economy it does not need." It was Mrs. Hale who told her, that evening, what had passed between Nathaniel and his father in the room where his father had died, 5 years before Evelyn ever came to Rothermere. How the old Duke, dying slowly and bitterly of a growth no physician could name, had gripped his son's wrist and told him that his own wife, Nathaniel's mother, had left them both when the boy was 10, because she had been permitted to believe she was loved rather than merely necessary, and that this was the single greatest failure of Reginald Rayne's life, and that Nathaniel must never repeat it, must never let a wife believe herself more than useful, for a woman who believes herself loved will always, eventually, ask for more than a man can safely give. "He built the boy out of that deathbed, Mrs." Hale said, not unkindly, same as some men are built out of war. "He's not cruel, Your Grace. He's frightened. He's been frightened since he was 10 years old, and frightened men make very cold husbands." Evelyn said nothing for a long moment, turning this over the way she turned over a column that would not balance. "That does not excuse Larch Cottage," she said finally. "No, Mrs." Hale agreed. "It explains it. Those are different countries, and a wise woman keeps her passport for only one of them." The county, meanwhile, had begun to speak of the young Duchess in a different register than it had 2 years before. She was no longer merely the practical woman Rothermere had married for his books. She was the woman who had dried Ferris's field in 3 weeks, when the old steward had let it flood for 3 years. She was the woman who had stood before the overseers with a ledger instead of a fainting fit, and won. Mrs. Grantley at the draper's shop in Denby Cross was heard to remark that her Grace had more sense in her account book than most men had in their whole heads, and though the remark was not meant to travel, it did, the way most things in a small county eventually do, the way water moves downhill, finding every low place there is to find. It was Ophelia Marsh who was dismissed first, though not by Evelyn, and not in the manner the county half expected. Nathaniel rode to Larch Cottage on a grey morning in late July, and did not stay the length of even 1 cup of tea. He told her plainly that the arrangement was ended, that she would want for nothing, a settlement sufficient to establish her comfortably elsewhere, her choice of town, but that Larch Cottage would be let to a new tenant by Michaelmas. Ophelia did not weep either, though for different reasons than Evelyn's. "You never loved either of us," she said, not as an accusation so much as an observation arrived at slowly and finally believed. "You loved not having to." He had no answer for that. He rode back to Rothermere Hall in silence, and did not speak of it to anyone, but Mrs. Hale reported, with the flat satisfaction of a woman confirming a long-held suspicion, that His Grace had gone straight to the old west wing that evening and unlocked, for the first time in 15 years, the sitting room that had belonged to his mother. He found Evelyn there 2 days later, not by design, but because she had heard the door was unsealed and had gone, out of the same forensic curiosity that ran every other part of her, to see what a man kept locked away for 15 years. Dust sheets, a writing desk, a miniature portrait of a woman with Nathaniel's same guarded eyes. "I used to think if I never opened it," he said from the doorway, "I could never be disappointed by what was inside. And now? Now I find it was only a room," he said. "Dust doesn't keep anyone out. It only keeps things from being looked at." He crossed to where she stood and, after a moment that stretched long enough for her to notice she was holding still, took the household keys from the hook where they had hung, unused by him since the day the papers reached his desk, and pressed them into her hand. "These have always been yours in practice," he said. "I should like them to be yours in fact. All of it, the strong box, the tenant accounts, the study itself. I am asking you to run what you have already been running, only now with my name on the authorization instead of standing between you and it." Evelyn looked down at the iron ring, worn smooth in places by 2 years of her own hands. "That is not an apology," she said. "No," he agreed. "It isn't. I have not asked for management, Nathaniel. I have had management for 2 years, and it cost me nothing, and taught me nothing about whether you saw me at all. If you want to say something to me, say it plainly, and say it once, and do not dress it as a set of keys." He was quiet a moment. Started again. "I do not know how to do it any other way yet," he said finally. "I have spent 30 years being taught that wanting a person allowed is how you lose them. I don't ask you to forgive that tonight. I ask you to let me show you, instead of telling you, and to judge me by the showing." "Show me then," Evelyn said. "Not tonight, not with words, over time, and where I can watch it, the way I watch everything else that matters to this estate." "All right," he said. "All right, then," Evelyn said, and it was, for the moment, the whole of the treaty between them. It was Mr. Lowe who first suggested, going through her father's papers in preparation for the separation settlement, that they search Hartley Chase's old strong room for anything relating to the debt Silas Rook continued, with increasing insistence, to raise. They found nothing that night, and nothing the next. It was Evelyn herself, 3 evenings later, running her hand along the inside of her mother's writing box out of nothing more than habit, who noticed the false bottom, a thin panel that gave, under pressure, where no panel ought to give. Inside was a single folded document, dated the spring of 1802, 2 years before Silas claimed the debt had been contracted. It was a deed of trust, drawn up by her mother, Margaret Hartley, in her own hand, and witnessed by a solicitor long since dead, conveying Hartley Chase irrevocably into trust for Evelyn's sole benefit, unreachable by any creditor of her father's, present or future. Pinned to the deed in her mother's small definite hand was a single line: "Being needed is not the same as being loved. I could not always give your father the second. I made certain, at least, that no one could ever take the first away from you." Evelyn sat a long time with the paper in her lap, the candle burning low, and did not open the drawer marked later. She let herself, for once, simply feel it, the particular ache of being protected, years in advance, by a woman who had not lived to see whether the protection was needed. It was needed within the month. Silas Rook, growing impatient, produced at last the document he had been threatening all summer, a bond purportedly signed by Edmund Hartley in 1804, acknowledging a debt of £4,200 to the late Duke Reginald Rane, secured against Hartley Chase, and demanded through his own solicitor that the debt be settled from the estate before any final separation of Rothermere's, and Evelyn's interests could proceed. He announced it, not privately, but at the Denby Cross Harvest Assembly, before half the parish, timing it precisely for the day the separation's final accounting was to be read aloud by the magistrate. The assembly hall at Denby Cross was full that afternoon in a way it was rarely full. For the harvest reckoning, yes, but more truly for the spectacle everyone had been promised, without anyone quite admitting they had been promised it. Sir Barnaby Cole, the county magistrate, sat at the long table at the front with the parish's ledgers before him, and Silas Rooke stood to one side with his bond in hand, and the particular ease of a man who believes he has already won. "The claim is straightforward," Silas said, when Sir Barnaby called for it. "A debt owed by the late Mr. Hartley, secured against the very land his daughter now proposes to keep entirely for herself. I do not raise this happily. I raise it because it is owed." Evelyn rose. She did not raise her voice. She had learned, across 2 years of overseer meetings and drainage disputes and a marriage conducted largely in the register of other people's assumptions, that a raised voice was very often mistaken for the truth, and a level one was very often mistaken for weakness, and that the second mistake was easier to correct. "May I see the bond, Sir Barnaby?" It was passed to her. She studied it a long moment, the signature, the date, the wax, while the hall waited in the particular silence of a room that does not yet know which way it is about to turn. "This bond is dated April the 3rd, 1804, she said finally. "I would ask Mr. Rooke to explain how my father pledged land in 1804, that he no longer held free and clear to pledge, since this deed," she said, laying her mother's trust beside the bond on the table, "conveyed Hartley Chase irrevocably to my benefit 2 years earlier, in 1802, witnessed and recorded. My father could not mortgage what was no longer his to mortgage. The bond is not merely forged. It is impossible." A murmur moved through the hall, water finding a new low place. Silas did not flinch outright, but something behind his composure went still. "Deeds are misplaced. Dates are misremembered. I would not stake a man's honesty on a single old paper." "Then stake it on 2, Evelyn said, and nodded to Mr. Lowe, who rose with a second document, a bank clerk's sworn statement establishing that the paper stock on which the bond was written bore a watermark not manufactured before 1811, 7 years after the debt it claimed to record. The hall's murmur sharpened. Sir Barnaby leaned forward. "I saw him practising it," said a voice from the back before anyone asked for it. Tam Foss, the stable boy from Rothermere, 12 years old, and plainly terrified to be speaking at all, twisting his cap in both hands. "Mr. Rooke, sir, in the estate office, of an evening last winter," writing the old Duke's name over and over on a scrap till it came out right. "I didn't know what it was for. I do now." Silas Rooke's composure, which had survived the watermark, did not survive the boy. Something in his face closed like a door someone had finally thought to lock. Evelyn did not press further than the truth required. "I do not ask the court for anything beyond what is owed," she said. "The bond is false. Hartley Chase remains where my mother placed it, out of reach of anyone who might one day decide I was worth less than my land. As to Mr. Rooke, I would ask for no prosecution, provided he leaves the county within the month and troubles this family no further. I have no wish to ruin a man for wanting what he could not have honestly earned. I have only wished, all my life, not to be taken from twice. Sir Barnaby looked at her a long moment, and then at Nathaniel, who had not spoken once through the whole proceeding, and who now stood as though something in his chest had come slightly loose. "So ordered," Sir Barnaby said. "The bond is void. The debt does not exist. And Mr. Rook will find, I think, that Denby Cross has grown considerably less comfortable for him." Nathaniel found his full accounting that same evening, in the west sitting-room, with his mother's portrait watching from above the mantel, and the household finally, properly, his wife's-in-law as well as in fact. "An apology and an explanation are not the same thing," Evelyn said, before he could begin. "I have had explanations from you before, dressed up as apologies. I want both tonight, and I want to know which is which." "The explanation," Nathaniel said, "is that my father taught me love was a debt collected at interest, and that the only safe household was one where nothing was risked because nothing was wanted aloud. I built my whole life around never being caught wanting. I married you because you asked nothing of me, and I mistook that mercy for 2 years for a kind of safety. I went to Larch Cottage because Ophelia asked nothing of me either, and I told myself that meant it cost nothing. It cost everything. It cost you." "That is the explanation," Evelyn said. "Now the apology." He was quiet a moment, started again. "I am sorry," he said, "not for marrying you without love. I did not know then what I was capable of feeling, and I do not think that sin can be undone by wishing it smaller than it was. I am sorry that I let you believe, for 2 years, that competence was the ceiling of what I saw in you, when it was only ever the floor. You were never merely useful to me, Evelyn. I told myself that sentence because it was safer than the true one. The true one is that I have not stopped noticing you since the day the papers reached my desk, and it terrifies me, and I am done pretending that terror is the same as indifference. You said once that I was a woman you required," Evelyn said. "Not a woman you loved." "I remember," he said. "I have thought of little else all summer. You are not a woman I require, Evelyn Hartley. You are a woman I would beg to keep, on whatever terms you set, for as long as you'll allow it." She let the silence hold a moment before she answered, because some things deserved a moment before they were answered. "My terms," she said, "are these. Hartley Chase remains mine. In trust, in law, in fact, regardless of what becomes of us. The tenant's wages are never again a household economy to be argued over at supper. My name goes on the estate's authorisations beside yours, not beneath them. I will not mediate what happens between you and your cousin's memory, or your father's ghost that is your reckoning, not mine. And I will not be told again, by you or by anyone, what I am for." "All right," Nathaniel said. "All right, then," Evelyn said, and something in the room, for the first time in 5 years, felt less like a held breath and more like the beginning of an ordinary one. Proof did not arrive all at once. It arrived the way most true things did at Rothermere Hall that autumn, in small units, none of them remarkable alone. He moved his chair at breakfast, without comment, from the far end of the table to the place beside hers. He began pouring her tea before she asked for it, and got the amount of milk wrong the first 4 mornings and right every morning after. He brought the estate ledgers to the west sitting-room in the evenings, instead of the study, so that the work of the house was done in the same room as the rest of their lives, and read the tenant accounts aloud to her, not because she needed to hear them, but because he had discovered he liked hearing his own voice say her name in the margin notes. Duchess approved, 14th of September, as though the approval itself were a kind of vow. There was one slip. In October, with the child a fortnight from due, a tenant came asking for an advance against next year's rent to repair a collapsed roof before winter, and Nathaniel, out of 18 years of habit, said yes and settled it himself before mentioning it to Evelyn at all. She noticed before he confessed it. "You did this alone," she said, not sharply, laying the ledger open between them. He stopped. Started again. "I did," he said. "Old habit. I am not undoing 5 years in 5 months. No," she agreed. "But name it when it happens, so I know it is habit and not backsliding." "It is habit," he said. "I am sorry. It will not happen again unnamed. It did not." Their son was born on a cold, clear night in early November, with Mrs. Hale directing the household in a voice that allowed for no panic, and Nathaniel pacing the hall outside until the midwife, taking pity, let him in to sit with Evelyn before the worst of it had even properly finished. He held his son an hour later with the particular stillness of a man who has just been handed something he does not yet trust himself not to break. And when Evelyn, exhausted and clear-eyed, asked what he was thinking, he said only, "That I would choose you. I have been choosing you for some time now, in small ways, hoping you'd notice before I found the courage to say it outright. I would choose you again tonight, knowing everything it cost to get here." "That is not the bare 3 words," Evelyn said, half a laugh in it, the first real one he had heard from her since the spring. "No," he agreed. "I find I trust the longer sentence more. It's harder to say by accident." They named the boy Edmund for her father, and Mrs. Hale pronounced him, on first inspection, to have his mother's eyes and, mercifully, none of his Uncle Silas's chin, which she delivered with such flat certainty that even the midwife laughed. 2 years passed the way years do at a working estate, in seasons rather than dates, in harvests rather than headlines. Silas Rook had gone north to a distant cousin's smaller property, where it was said he managed accounts honestly now, chastened by a fall. No one in Denby Cross much mourned. Ophelia Marsh had married a wool merchant in Bath the following spring, and wrote to Evelyn once a year, brief and courteous letters that asked after the boy, and said nothing of the past, which both women understood to be its own kind of grace. Tam Foss, whose honesty had undone a forger before a full county hall, was apprenticed properly to the estate's steward that same autumn, and by the second harvest was keeping half of Hartley Chase's accounts himself. In a hand Evelyn had taught him letter by letter on winter evenings. Fair wages were posted now at the start of every harvest, not negotiated fresh each year against whatever economy someone had decided the house required. A school had opened in the old dower cottage at Hartley Chase, for tenant children of either land, funded from Evelyn's own trust and named, at Mrs. Hale's insistence and over Evelyn's mild protest, the Margaret Hartley School, so that her mother's hand, dead 19 years, still opened doors for children who would never know her name otherwise. The household keys hung now by the kitchen door in 2 matched rings instead of 1 Evelyn's, worn smooth from years of use, and a second set Nathaniel had commissioned and carried himself, not because he ran the house day to day, but because he had asked, that first autumn, to be trusted with a share of its keeping rather than merely its ownership, and she had at last let him earn it. "I reckon," Nathaniel said one evening, watching Edmund toddle determinedly across the west sitting-room toward a dog too patient to mind being climbed on, "that's the first sound investment my father ever made without meaning to. Marrying me to a woman who could actually read a ledger." "You reckon?" Evelyn repeated, amused despite herself, because 2 years of tenant suppers and drainage disputes had worn certain rough words smooth in his mouth, the way the county wore them smooth in everyone's. "I reckon," he said again, and did not correct himself, and she understood it for what it was, not a slip of grammar, but a man who had finally stopped performing a class of coldness he had never actually wanted, in a house that had, at last, stopped holding its breath. She had stopped asking to be seen somewhere in the 2nd year of that long construction, not because she had given up on it, but because she had made herself, quietly, methodically, out of ledges and drained fields and a mother's hidden trust, entirely impossible not to see. Being needed had never been the same as being loved. She knew that still, and would teach her son the difference the way her mother had taught her. But she had learned, in the years it took to build a life too solid to be devalued twice, that a person could be both needed and loved at once, and that the rarity of it was not a reason to distrust it when it finally, carefully, arrived, not because the wound had healed without a mark, not because the county had forgotten what it once whispered about the Duke and his cottage, but because she had made her worth a fact rather than a hope, entered in her own hand, in her own book, and no one, not a husband, not a cousin, not a forged and dated lie, could ever again cross it out.